If you're listening to this, welcome to the VIP section. You already know my name. I'm gonna skip all the introductions because today, this is not like interviews or whatever. Well, it is an interview, but this is not like your favorite alt artist. Like this is like I'm taking you out to school because I had to do a final project for a class that I was taking, and I figured why not make it a video essay so that I can also post it on YouTube because I think this topic was pretty interesting, and I hope that you think it's interesting too and important because everything to do with queerness is important on this space. Um, but yeah, I got to interview Dr. Uju Anya, and I hope that she's kind of a big deal. If you don't know, get to know. But yeah, I hope you enjoy. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. When people in the West think of Africa, LGBTQ plus identities are rarely the first thing that come to mind. Instead, Africa is often positioned as inherently anti-queer as a continent, and this perception is shaped by two key factors. First, Africa has a long history of being othered by the West, initially in racial terms, and later sexually as well. The continent and its peoples have been cast as oppositional to Western norms, both socially and sexually. Historically, Western narratives shaped Africa as too excessive. So that includes too polygamous, too promiscuous, too deviant, too homosexual, and so on. Today, however, these same narratives construct Africa as the opposite. So too homophobic, too heteronormative, too repressive. This shift reflects a pattern in which Africa is perpetually defined against Western standards rather than on its own terms. The second factor would be that many African nations have also embraced this heteronationalism or even anti-homonationalism, which is as a means of asserting moral and cultural independence and even superiority from the West. This can be seen as the result of post-colonial cultural amnesia and an ongoing coloniality of being. Pre-colonial understandings of gender and sexual fluidity were violently erased during colonial rule, and today many post-colonial governments uphold these rigid sexual norms as if they are indigenous despite their colonial origins. A key debate within African queer studies is whether the term queer is even appropriate when discussing our realities in terms of gender and sexual fluidity on the African continent. Some argue that queer is too rooted in Western academia and activism to fully capture African realities, while others believe that queer, when used in an African context, can take on a new meaning that could reflect our continent's long history of diverse sexual and gender expressions. So the term's association with the possibility of otherness and making otherness good might in fact make it a useful tool for reclaiming our erased histories. In his essay, Queer Studies and Religion in Contemporary Africa, Adrian Van Klinken suggests that for queer to be meaningfully applied in Africa, several critical questions must be addressed. Number one, what new identities are being created in African queer communities? Number two, whose norms do they align with or challenge? Number three, how do they relate to indigenous terms and frameworks for gender and sexuality? And number four, how does increased queer visibility impact homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia on the continent? At its core, the conversation around queerness in Africa is a linguistic and historical process. To fully understand how gender and sexuality are framed today, we must examine three key moments. Number one, pre-colonial African understandings of gender and sexuality. Number two, the impact of colonization on language and discourse around queerness. And number three, the role of colonial languages in shaping modern queer identities and how we might reclaim or reinvent these languages alongside Western queer theory to reflect African realities. This is the framework I will follow as I walk through this history. My goal is not to create a singular definition of African queerness because, and I can't stress this enough, Africa is not a monolith. My experiences as a queer Nigerian do not reflect the experiences of all queer Africans. And as I will discuss later, many factors, including language, culture, class, and geography, can shape the way in which LGBTQ plus Africans articulate their identities. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to this process. Rather, this is more so a personal exercise, an attempt to situate my own identity within the vast and complex history of queerness in Africa. By tracing this history, I hope to better understand how I and others can language our realities in ways that feel both authentic and empowering. My motivations behind doing this research is just because I think that oftentimes when we discuss kind of Nigerian and African intellectualism, they usually center feminism or post-colonial kind of decolonial strategies. And while these are very useful, a lot of times they are still rooted in these homophobic and queerphobic sentiments. We see that even with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who used to be my icon, my role model, and her violent transphobia multiple times, and whilst she remains a popular figure in Nigerian intellectualism and around the globe. I want to give a different perspective on the thoughts that are coming out of the African continent and the scholars that are working to deconstruct homophobia as being inherently African and work back to our roots. And to do this, I got the opportunity to interview Dr. Uju Anya, who is a professor of language at Carnegie Mellon University and a Nigerian by ancestry. She's also a proud lesbian and she lives with her wife and her daughter. And it was really great to interview her, but I'm really excited for you all to see what we talked about. Across various African societies, gender and sexuality were historically understood through social roles and community positioning rather than rigid biological categories. Among the Igbo, for example, the concept of male daughters challenged binary gender norms. If a father lacked male heirs, he could designate a daughter to become male, granting her inheritance rights and social authority typically reserved for sons. This demonstrates that gender was not strictly tied to biological sex, but was instead shaped by societal roles. Linguistically, the Igbo language also reflects a less rigid gender binary than English. While terms for man, nwoke, and woman, nwanyi, exist, the language lacks strict gendered pronouns like he and she. Instead, the third person singular pronoun o is neutral, and possessives such as ya are used for both men and women. Where English distinguishes between master and mistress, or actor and actress, or even waiter and waitress, Igbo uses a single gender-neutral terms for role and professions. For instance, a male daughter would be called dibuno, the same genderless title given to any head of a family, regardless of sex. I do want to point out that I am not really Igbo, so I apologize for my pronunciation. Beyond the Igbo and beyond Nigeria, diverse African cultures also recognize fluid gender roles and same-sex relationships. For example, in Buganda, modern-day Uganda, King Mwanga II had openly male lovers, challenging the notion that same-sex relationships are un-African. Among the Dagaba people of Ghana, individuals who embodied both masculine and feminine traits are acknowledged and integrated into society. Similar gender-fluid roles existed also across many ethnic groups, even in Nigeria. Same-sex intimacy was often tied to spiritual and ritual practices, reinforcing its presence within African cultural traditions, rather than marking it as deviant.
We may not have identified, for example, let's say cultural practices that were like distinctly queer. Like, for example, in the cultures that we recognize that had it, pre-colonial times, it's like when we can identify it, it's within cultural practices like religious initiation, for example, or within like how people organize property inheritance or something like that. We can't say that it was celebrated pre-colonial everywhere. But we can't even say it was a remarkable thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Because it's just normal. We can only say it was a remarkable thing when we observe it as a big remarkable thing, like priestess initiation and priestess groups, matriarchal religious groups and things like that. They were very like homo everything.
Yeah. With the arrival of European colonial powers, African understandings of gender and sexuality were violently reshaped to fit Western Christian norms. Colonial administrations imposed strict legal and religious structures that criminalized previously accepted practices. For example, the British colonial government imposed anti sodomy laws across its African territories, many of which remain in effect today. As we said before, these remain in effect largely due to the heteronationalism of African post colonial governments, but I digress. Another example is just the fact that missionary Christianity played a significant role in enforcing European gender binaries. So, indigenous gender diverse roles were erased, demonized, or suppressed under the guise of civilizing Africans. While this was going on, colonizers exploited African bodies even as they imposed these strict moral restrictions. European officials documented sexual encounters with African men and women, and colonial soldiers engaged in exploitative relationships despite preaching strict morality. At this point, I could go on and talk about how this ties into Afro-pessimism because they don't see those marked black as people, as Frank Wilderson would put it. But that's another topic for another day. Colonial rule not only criminalized queerness in the past, but also distorted historical memory, leading to today's widespread belief that LGBTQ plus identities are Western imports. In reality, it was homophobia, not queerness, that was imported through colonization. Despite independence, many African states continued to uphold colonial era sexual norms, reinforcing homophobia through law, religion, and nationalist rhetoric. Political leaders often frame queerness as a foreign threat, ignoring the extensive historical evidence of gender and sexual diversity across the continent. However, African LGBTQ plus communities are actively resisting these narratives by reclaiming language and reshaping how queerness is understood. Dr. Anya argues that colonial languages may have influenced how we discuss queerness, but they do not have to define it. Just as in Nigeria, we were able to develop Nigerian English and Pidgin as linguistic adaptations of British English, queer Nigerians can similarly reshape language to better reflect our own identities. Linguistic adaptation is not a betrayal of African identity. It is a reclamation of agency. I know that scholars like Ngugi wa Thiong'o might disagree because he believes that to decolonize the mind, you must first of all decolonize your language. But I think that decolonizing language doesn't necessarily mean rejecting language that was given to us colonially.
The Nigerian English that we speak, right, is very much our own.
Yeah.
In terms that it's identifiable as a dialect of English in the same way that you would have, Irish English or Indian English or Jamaican English, etc.
Yeah.
So much in the same way, I think we can definitely reinvent ourselves linguistically.
Yeah.
As queers in Nigeria.
Thus, creating new terminology for queerness is not about rejecting colonial languages outright, but about reworking them to fit African realities. When discussing the language that Africans use to articulate their realities, it's important to pay attention to the role that class can play in discussing realities. How did Nigeria create two kind of languages as from the same similar source?
Sure.
Same as
And
everyone.
that is what's created, with proximity, right? And so there was this proximity of geographical proximity, and then there was like the proximity of dominance, right? So you had to do all your administration and conduct your daily business, your government affairs, your education, all kinds of things in the colonial language. So there's kind of like the Nigerian English that's closest to that type of Nigerian English. And then there's the Pidgin, that is definitely like much more widely spoken across communities that don't necessarily speak English.
Yeah.
So then that's when you have like a lot of influence, a lot of grammatical like differences, and definitely vocabulary and lexical differences that make it like very, very unique. So let's see here. If we say that only, let's say, the upper class or the Western educated are the ones that are going to be conversant in queer language and, wanting to make words or trying to make culture, right? In living and affirming and identifying, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to say it's only rich people who do that. You know what I'm saying? Like, poor people also are queer and also are trying to, you know, do their thing and date and figure out, whatever. And so I think that in that sense, everybody's going through the same journey. So I can't say these people are,
Mm-hmm.
queering more than others or involved in this more than others. I cannot say that. Now, what I can say is that because of the deep corruption we live in here in the US, but certainly in Nigeria, and the fact that this homosexuality thing, has been villainized and criminalized, um, poor people are much more vulnerable to the abuses of a legal system that penalizes queerness.
Yeah.
Um, so being that their lives are a lot more fraught and perilous, right? At least in the reality of today,
Yeah.
uh, I would definitely say that maybe they can't be as open and as public as anybody else and engage in things that would be uh, too much that way. Because when they are, and they are, um, they get persecuted.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
I were to say that there's any difference, I would say that there may be a difference in the ability to be very public and open um, in communicating queerness and signifying queerness, um, which maybe lead to like a lot more contact and stuff and connections and um, thus more participation in whatever queer people are doing. And um, the difference that I can say is that level of isolation and level of security, and that may affect language.
This is something that I want to point out, especially going back to the fact that my reality is not the same as everybody's reality on the continent or even in my country of Nigeria. Um, and to reiterate that I'm not trying to advocate for the word queer to be used by everybody, but instead for us to be able to look back at our history because our history does exist and find frameworks or find terms or find ways to articulate our reality based off of that in a way that feels genuine to us. One of the things that I learned from my interview with Dr. Anya is just kind of how authenticity as an African means different things, where people think that authenticity would mean to reject all colonial languages and speak only in your native language. That can be kind of unrealistic, especially in a country like Nigeria with over 300 languages spoken. People need a lingua franca, and English does a good job of being that lingua franca. And with that in mind, we need a term or terms to articulate ourselves across languages, across cultures. The right of choice is something that was stripped from us with colonization. And I just hope that this has kind of given a little bit more of a bigger picture and given you back your agency. And so ultimately, the question isn't whether Africa can be queer, because queerness has always existed on the continent. The real question is how Africans can reclaim, reframe, and redefine queerness in ways that honor both history and contemporary lived realities. Africa's queerness is not an import. It's a resurgence, a reclaiming of knowledge that has been there all along.